Geneva Accords in terms of the laws of warfare, and asked Lieber to write an opinion as to where nations began. When does a nation originate? Is it with the legal documents that actually enact its nationhood, or is it some kind of more spiritual, nebulous, sort of ethereal kind of authenticity that arrives in a kind of culture before the documents come in to confirm it? To Lincoln, he says, the Declaration is the apple of gold within the picture of silver. By that picture, he means the frame. The picture of silver is the Constitution, but the thing in the center of the frame is the Declaration. On this, he had a lot of argument. But it was Lincoln's way of thinking that the Union was integral, inseparable from the notion of the freeing of the slaves. Nonetheless, he goes back and forth on this idea. He invites a group of free black leaders to the White House in late August of 1862 and says to them, you know, you ought to look and lead a movement of free blacks out of the country to colonize elsewhere, in Panama. Convinced that, as he says, but for your race there would be no war. But for your race there would be no war. Blaming, in a sense, the war going on around him, on the presence of the African American. Now, you could argue that what Lincoln was really saying is, but for our experience, the way we brought you here, the way we enslaved you, there would be no war. Then he goes on to say, we cannot coexist together in harmony. And maybe what he meant was, given our history, we cannot live together in harmony. But it was a startling statement nonetheless. And Frederick Douglass is outraged. He says it's like a horse thief blaming the presence of the horse as the reason for his act. Lincoln invites a group of religious leaders to the White House who are objecting to his slow pace on emancipation in September, and he says to them, they say, why are you not going faster? And he says, why should I? How can I emancipate? And he lists off all the things I just described to you earlier in the talk. If I do so, if I don't have the power to do it, even if I did do it, I can't do it in the states that I don't know any control over anymore, and I can't do it in half the nation and not in the other half of the nation, and on, even as he's got the document in his drawer. Even as he was only 3 weeks away from issuing. There are 3 versions of the Emancipation Proclamation. The first one is authored by Lincoln in the Telegraph Office. He brings it to the cabinet meeting in late July of 1862. Only Wells and Seward know that the document's been in the works, and he reads it aloud to the cabinet there. Seward speaks up and says, I think it's an act, it will be seen as an act of desperation if it's done at a time when the war is going so poorly for us. Let's wait till we have a victory so we can use it as sort of the crowning blow. Excuse me. And Lincoln hears that, puts the document back in his drawer, and abides by Seward's reflection. When he gets to Antietam, which happens in September 22nd, 1862, the worst day in American warfare, still the worst day, Lincoln looks upon this as a qualified victory, and as a result decides he's going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But as he does, the document itself works as a kind of threat. He says, if you do not put down your arms, if you do put down your arms and join us, there will be a compensated, gradual end to slavery, not a sudden one. He had referred in earlier conversation, in fact in the debates of 1858 with Stephen Douglas, he had said that you could imagine a very, very slow pace to the ending of slavery, one that would leave it not extinct until perhaps 100 years, which would mean that slavery would have gone on to the time of Elvis Presley and jukeboxes and Brown versus the Board of Education and Dwight Eisenhower. Hard to contemplate. Lincoln, during all this time, is struggling internally with his belief that he can affect change and his knowledge that he is the victim of circumstances. It is a struggle that has gone on for him through most of his life. He is an Enlightenment figure. He believes in science. He never been a religious man, never joined a church. He was an agnostic. The tradition of Tom Paine. And yet he had found himself in circumstances where he felt things were out of his control. That science itself was no answer to the ills of man. That fate had its own determination. There's a theory, for instance, that in the time when McClellan and the other generals are being taught at West Point, much of the thinking about warfare was built around the teachings of people like Jomini, the French war strategist who believed in a kind of science of warfare. This predated the sort of Clausewitzian notion of a much more brutal form of warfare that we found prevailed into the 20th century. Lincoln had not read any of these. It's a very charming moment at the beginning of his presidency when his secretary brings him a series of books and plunks them down on his desk and say, here, you want to learn about warfare, here's what you should study, as if he's studying algebra or something for the first time. And yet he was probably, almost certainly, our most hands-on warrior president we've ever had in our nation's history. And yet here he relied upon McClellan, a man who was a brilliant student in this science of warfare, and discovered that he could not affect the results that he had intended. And here he was, the war getting more and more brutal, less and less predictable. It affects a kind of spiritual crisis for Lincoln. And so you find him by the end of 1862 increasingly referencing God in a kind of fatalistic way. God has his own logic. Right up to the final day when on the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation sits on his desk, and even then no one is certain that he's going to sign it. And Mary Lincoln leans in on the night before, January 1st, 1863, and says, have you made your mind up? And he says, it's out of my hands, woman, it's out of my hands. But he does sign it, and we're a different nation because of it. Thank you very much for your time today. I went a little over. I'll entertain any questions that anybody might have, or comments, or anybody who wants to rail about Donald Trump, you can do that too. Yes?
You obviously studied Lincoln a great deal. Having been born in the South, and having said that Lincoln believed that all men were created equal, how are Southerners to think about the fact that Lincoln made sure that Union troops were buried properly and Confederate troops, Southern human beings, were not?
Yeah. That's a very good point. What do you make of it?
I don't know. Disappoints me.
Yeah. I do think that you learn very quickly in studying Lincoln that he was not a great believer in equality. I say in the book that he started the conversation on equality. He did not believe in slavery. Clearly abhorred slavery. He wanted an end to slavery, but his notion of the sin of slavery was the more that it was economic than it was racial. Now it's like I'm dodging your question. I'm not. I'm going to come back to it. But he believed that no man should reap the benefits of another man's work. Right? That was what he found abhorred about slavery. And he says in his debates with Stephen Douglas that it would be wrong for anyone to presume from what he says that he believes in the equality of the races. And so when we think of Lincoln, it's important that we understand him not as believing in equality in the modern sense. I think that what I learned was that he was a man with a terrific number of flaws. Now, whether he would have remedied that, memorializing them properly, I don't know. You might forgive him that in the moment in the middle of the war, when he's establishing this memorial plan, that he's not keen on establishing it for his enemy. But it certainly is stark to think about how long it went before the North was willing to accept that the death of soldiers in the South was equatable with death of soldiers in the North. It's a very good point. Yes, the very back. Yes.
When he consulted the theorist about nationhood to determine the primacy either of the Declaration or the Constitution, what answer did he get?
Well, Lieber was a great believer that Lieber's a very interesting character. I don't know if you've read. There's a wonderful book by a Yale law professor called The Lieber Code. It came out a couple of years ago. It's very interesting. Lieber's really becomes the philosopher king for Lincoln's approach to welfare going forward from 1862. He's a Prussian immigrant who comes to America. Is a professor in South Carolina. Has two sons, one who ends up fighting for the South, one who ends up fighting for the North. He eventually goes to Columbia, becomes a professor at Columbia. He is convinced that Lincoln is fighting the war much too timidly. He believes in hard wars. He believes in decisive wars. He says that the way to end war is to fight war with an iron fist. So he's a very important person for the way that the war is conducted post-1862. Excuse me. But Lieber is convinced that the notion of nationhood is, in fact, he's the one who advances this theory that nationhood really comes from something earlier. Something, in this case, the Declaration is a demonstration of it. He was really more giving Lincoln license to be able to declare it so. Excuse me, as I say, for a man of law, it's astonishing to think of Lincoln saying that something predating a legal document establishing an entity is somehow more powerful as a recognition of its origin point than the legal document itself. But I think, as I apply in the book, I think there was some wishful thinking on Lincoln's part to be able to read it that way. There's also an interesting thing that happens at the end of 1862 on this whole question of whether the slaves, having been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, could then be re-enslaved. And Lincoln asked his Attorney General, Edward Bates, to come up with an opinion as to whether the slaves, having been free, to be re-enslaved. And he looks at Dred, the decision of Dred Scott, and examines it for the fact that Taney, Chief Justice Roger Taney, had written it to say that no Negro could ever be a citizen of the United States, free or slave. Excuse me. And he says, well, let's back up and see where the decision comes. And he says, well, the Dred Scott cannot bring this lawsuit. He has no standing because he's not a citizen of the United States. And Bates says, well, then at that point, the decision ends. There's no reason for Taney to go on further. Everything that Taney says after that is dictum, really. In other words, it's irrelevant to the decision itself. And therefore,